And as always, I like to take this time at the beginning of our practice group, weekly practice group, just to do my best to appreciate that we can gather this way, our own virtual Dharma hall, meditation hall. So take the time, look at the folks that are joining in, and interrupt that any habits that any of us might have around feeling apart or separate. It's nice to have friends to practice with. And we'll settle into our meditation posture, whatever that might look like for each of us. Some balance between a sense of comfort, stability in the body, but also this quality of uprightness. So we want to support the mind being interested, the mind being awake, and we should notice this way of being, this mind that is all about practice. It should feel a bit like an altered state, like not a normal state of mind, because unfortunately our normal state of mind, generally speaking, is a mind that's distracted, the mind that is lost in thought one way or another. So that means we're not thinking about practice, we're actually interested now in opening or receiving, sensing the immediacy of the present moment, the natural sensitivity of the mind through the six sense gates, seeing, being known, hearing is being known, touches are being felt, smells and tastes being known, mental activities being known. As best we can, sensing this exposure through these six sense gates. We call this sense experience or sensuality. And much of our practice is learning how to be not confused, not pushed around by sense experience, including our thoughts about sense experience. So in a very deep way, we're normalizing the flow of sense experience to such a degree that, at least in moments, there's a very stable quality of not being surprised by what comes and goes, whether it's as thought, emotion, sound, sight, touch, smell, or taste. But instead, there's this very stable understanding, oh, it's like this now. This is being known, this is being felt. Can this be okay? Just to let this sense experience come, go, As the Buddha says, even among what is uneven. So the flow of sense experience, it's constantly changing. It's definitely a little wild and unpredictable, sometimes intense, sometimes subtle, sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant, and everything in between. But can it be okay that in this moment it's like this? The totality of the mind sensitivity is like this now, isn't it? And however it is right now for each of us, its nature is to keep changing. And we're cultivating this interest to be right in this place where experience is coming and going. So not to get lost in our thoughts about experience. We don't need to suppress or repress thoughts. We're just practicing not being confused or not being lost or identified with the thoughts. And the stability comes primarily from the non-attachment to whatever it is that we're sensitive to moment by moment by moment. We don't have to figure anything out. It's as if the wisdom in the heart understands that right now it's like this. This is being felt. Can this be okay? Whatever it is that's coming and going now. So it has this flavor of balance or stability, an unshakable ease with conditions, no matter the conditions, good, bad, pleasant, unpleasant. And you might even want to experiment just reminding the heart of this possibility of being at ease with conditions. And it can be as simple as just repeating that word ease, or the whole phrase ease with conditions, ease with the way it is now, or the question, can this be okay? And that question is, in a sense, pointing the mind, opening the mind to what's moving now, whatever it is that's predominant. Can this be okay? That this is moving, this thought or this sensation, this mental image. Even among what is uneven. Peaceful in the midst of what might appear to be wild, this movement of experience coming and going. It takes some real dedication to keep the present moment in mind, this stillness in the midst of the activity of the moment. So in a way, we're learning how to remember both the stillness, the stability of presence in the midst of all that's coming and going. The dance of sensation and sound and sight and thought and everything else that's moving. And this is a good definition of equanimity, the flavor of the path, the flavor even of awakening, this ease, this peacefulness, even the stillness in the midst of all that's moving. So the world of conditions has full permission to do what it's doing. And we're keeping in mind the heart that's even, that's unafraid, that appreciates allowing everything to be. So let's continue now in silence. So remember, we're learning how to be even among what is uneven, at ease with conditions, the changing nature of conditions. And of course, the mind, because of habit, will get caught up, will get attached and agitated because of the attachments, being identified with problem solving or worrying or whatever it might be. But we can always begin again. This willingness to feel what's moving, see what's moving, hear what's moving. Is it possible to be right in the middle, open, sensitive, without taking a stance? Take a little time to move the body, stretch a little if you'd like. Thanks for showing up, everyone. Nice to be together. So I'll save a little time at the end for discussion, but I'll reflect tonight on just equanimity with sense experience. And one of the things, especially at the beginning of a meditation period, where we go from our usual state of being distracted and thinking about this and that, and we sit down and we suddenly, for as if for the first time, notice how much is in motion, like in our bodies, just even energetically, how much is in motion in our minds, like a waterfall sometimes, thoughts just spewing, and how much is moving in us and around us. And then we, with practice, over time, we find this paradoxical stability, evenness, presence in the midst of all this movement of thought and sound and emotion and sensation and all the changing aspects of our experience. And some of you have heard this wonderful little teaching from Ajahn Chah about still flowing water. And I won't go into it, but just making the point that there is this paradox that is really the nature of our experience on a more subtle level, that there is both stillness and there's also flow or movement. And in a way, our job as a practitioner is not to be confused by movement. And just generally, the movement is the movement of sense experience, or you could even say sensuality. It's emotion. When we talk to ourselves about it, when we use language and we describe, oh, I'm sitting and I'm feeling this, we make things more stable and concrete than they actually are. There's a phrase I've been reflecting on from Sylvia Boorstein, where she says, desire pulls so hard, it's surprising to find that it's empty. So when we have a desire, the desire to get rid of something, the desire to get something, hold on to something, that tug, it's impressive. When we have a strong desire, which we have, all the time throughout the day. I'm a little cold. There can be a strong desire to put a sweater on or turn the heat up. A little hot, desire to turn the heat down or take off a sweater. The desire to move the body, the desire to solve a problem or think through something, plan something. And there's nothing wrong, nothing unskillful about this movement of desire, desiring, right? It just comes with the territory of being alive. But when we get identified, when we start taking desires personally, then what we take ourselves to be is pushed around by our desires, the push and pull of our liking and disliking. And so we feel, our subjective experience feels all over the place, feels agitated not because in a real sense there's somebody who's agitated, but the mind has gotten identified with these movements of desire. And it's like identifies, grasps one movement of desire only to grasp another movement of desire a second later, and then another and another. And so it's no wonder we feel a little bit spun out, discombobulated by our existence. So in a way, when we're the practice of sitting meditation, where we on purpose we find a time of the day and a place to sit and a way to sit that, yeah, just is simple and conducive to not being agitated, it should it should sort of catch our attention, like how activated we still are, even though we found a time, a way to sit, all these, we've created favorable conditions, and yet it's still often, at the beginning at least, a pretty wild scene in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts when we're sitting. There's kind of a standing joke, in meditation circles, people who think they have a good sit, it often means that, they sit down and they have a thought which leads to another thought, and before you know it, the 45 minutes or the half an hour is over, and and the subjective experience was, well, that went pretty well, that was easy. But it's because they created those, suitable conditions to be lost in thought. But what we want to do is not that, right? We want to get interested in the movement, but we can't be interested in the movement and caught in the movement at the same time. It's a different allegiance, right? The allegiance of being identified with whatever the predominant movement is in the body and mind at any given moment, versus allegiance with the presence, the knowing of what's moving. And this can teach us a little bit about equanimity with sense experience, with the movement of sense experience. So we're not, because a lot of times, we understand, it's pretty relatively easy for us to understand the need for stability. We feel the swirl of our lives. We feel the groundlessness. We feel discombobulated. And so we want ground, we want stability, but that doesn't mean we know how to get it. And we wrongly think that by latching on to something, because there is a semblance of stability when the mind latches on to something. But that something, whatever it is that it latches onto, it is in the process of dissolving and changing and disappearing. So it has to relatch and relatch and relatch. So the discovery from the Buddha and probably other wise people over the centuries is that there's real stability only in letting go, in the non-attachment. The non-attachment with what's moving. So letting the movements be the movements, the movement of sensation, the movement of thought, the movement of emotion, sights and sounds and smells and tastes. And what stabilizes things is to realize, to understand, to wake up to this way of relating that is non-attachment, right? So we're sensitive, we feel, we're sensing what's moving, and we're relating with non-attachment, non-clinging, non-identification, non-grasping. So things are coming and going, the heart's sensitive as it is to things that are coming and going, and it continues to relate with non-attachment. So there's more and more stability in the midst of everything moving. And it's really, we'll sense it directly in our heart, in our mind, as a kind of spiritual superpower, that we can be right in the middle of what's moving and not losing clarity. The trouble with when the mind gets attached, then all of a sudden understanding is limited by the attachment. Whatever I'm clinging to, even something seemingly skillful, like we're sitting and we're clinging to the idea that my body should be still or my spine should be upright. So that might masquerade as like, oh, no, that's a good thought. But if the mind is clinging to that thought, and as I mentioned, that thought, oh, I should be still, my body should be still. It's like it has to be renewed because that thought doesn't last very long. No, no, really, I should be still. Am I moving? Right? So there's this sort of restlessness even in the clinging to something because whatever the mind is clinging to isn't inherently stable. And there's always some lingering doubt like, well, maybe I should be clinging to this or identified with that. But this refuge of wisdom, the wisdom of letting go, the wisdom of non-attachment, the wisdom of just letting nature be nature, including the nature of the thinking mind to think I should be still when I'm sitting, or I should be upright, I should be slouched when I'm sitting, or my mind should be on the meditation object and only the meditation object, or whatever other kinds of thoughts we might have about our meditation practice. I'm a better meditator than someone else, or they're a better meditator than me, or maybe I need a different teacher or a different style of practice. A lot of people are talking about meditation apps these days. I wonder which one I should get. I mean, there's endless thoughts we can have. Am I already awakened? Maybe my practice is over. But that refuge of wisdom, its very nature is not to be confused by whatever it is that's moving, like a thought, any of those thoughts that I just said. Right? Wisdom would know that's just something moving. It's a thought being known, a sensation being felt, a sound being heard, a sight being seen. And what, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, what stabilizes the practice there is the non-attachment to what's moving. Normally we think to really get grounded, I kind of have to stake my existence on something. But actually, wisdom can stake its existence, so-called existence, on the non-clinging. Whatever comes and goes, the practice is the non-clinging. And it actually ends up providing a kind of stability that we never find anywhere else. It's sort of, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, it really turns out to be a superpower, because not that it happens all the time for us, but, every once in a while, long while, things happen that are really out of the box. Something really good happens in our life, or something really bad happens in our life, or something really unexpected happens. And it's just so wonderful to see the mind, the heart, gravitate to the practice, which is, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I know my refuge is in the non-clinging. So this is happening. Now it's like this, out of the box, something terrible, something wonderful, something surprising. And who knows what we'll do, like how the body, mind, heart, whatever will respond, what we'll do, what we won't do. But the practitioner, right, the practice knows what to do, not cling. And it doesn't feel like much, like when we talk about it in words, but you'll see when, as it develops in your own heart, you'll feel it as a kind of stability, even, even more provocatively, a kind of solidity, like, like in a very kind of ordinary psychological sense. I know what I'm doing in my life. It's just that we can't talk to people about it because it doesn't make sense. I know my way. I know my path, not clinging. It's like someone were to ask us, heart to heart, what makes you tick? What's really important for you? It doesn't make sense for us in most circles to say, I'm really into non-clinging, you know, but it's it's the kind of answer we'd like to hear from a friend, a good friend, right? It would be inspiring to us. However life goes, yeah, I can let my preferences, when I'm not stepping on other people's toes, I can let my preferences have their say. But what I'm really practicing is the non-clinging. Evenness among what is uneven. And you can read the suttas, the discourses from the Buddha, and there are endless, just so many passages that talk about the abandoning of craving. Here's one from the Dhammapada, this wonderful collection of verses. Not even with a shower of gold coins would we find satisfaction in sensual craving. Knowing that sensual cravings are suffering, that they bring little delight, the wise one does not rejoice even in divine pleasures. One who delights in the ending of craving is a disciple of the fully awakened one. One who delights in the ending of craving is a disciple of the fully awakened one. Right? This is our path. We're finding our way, with practice, we're finding our way to the joy, the release of non-clinging, the unbinding of those habits of clinging, of craving. And in any moment will do, right? Because in any moment, the deeply ingrained habit to cling, to crave, is getting activated, right? Like I'm starting to feel a little cool in this room as the temperature drops and inadequate heat at this time. So how the experience of coolness, of being a little cold, activates the desire to be warmer. And so that desire's there, and it's like something shiny is dangling, because the mind's tendency is to want to identify with that desire. I'm a person who's cold, who wants to be warmer. And it's like, we talk about birth and death, rebirth, it's kind of a conversation topic in Buddhist circles, but that is a rebirth. Like any moment where the mind identifies with desire, and that's what we call craving, when there's identification with desire, then there's a sense, then all of a sudden there's a me, Mark, a person, right? And the person wants to be warmer. So there's a birth as the person who wants to be warmer, who's not okay with the way it is. In a way, in a normal sense, existence, having a life, is always some identification with craving. That's who we are in that more ordinary relative sense. We meet our friends. What we're really meeting are moments of that person being identified with desire, their craving. Right? That's what's familiar. The ways our friends crave this and crave to be away from that. We don't think about it that way, but as we train in the Buddhist teachings, we'll see that more and more. Like, oh, just everywhere we look, people we know, people we don't know, we'll see a mind that is identified with desire all the time. And what we want to see is the agitation, the restless agitation, the tightness of that identification with desire. and how it limits. It's like that rebirth as moment by moment, the rebirth as somebody who wants to be warmer, right? That's such a limited way to experience the moment. Being the one who wants something delightfully tasty in the fridge that I'm going to go visit as soon as this program's over, you know, or whatever births we take rebirth into with our desires, you know, the one who's going to turn the heat up as soon as this program's over, or is going to immediately, you know, put my hat back on and put a scarf around my neck and put fire in the wood stove. Some of you have heard, you know, about the jhanas, and most often the Buddha talks about the four jhanas, which are just different, more refined states of meditative absorption. And the fourth jhana is the experience. It's defined as the experience where the mind is so tuned in to the pleasure of seclusion that the habit of craving is temporarily completely suppressed. So one experiences, tastes this mind without craving. That's why it's considered such a sublime, healing, meditative experience to have a. And the way that happens is there's a pleasure, you know, there's pleasure when we have nice sense experiences, but there's also a pleasure of not needing sense experience. And that we would say is a non-sensual pleasure. So the pleasure of non-dependence on sense pleasures we'd call that in Buddhist terms a non-sensual pleasure. And so even when we start meditating, you know, and we get a little bit of continuity with our meditation object, let's say we're aware of our breath coming in, aware of the breath going out, and we've cultivated enough interest and enough, you know, just transformed some of our habits of distraction that we start to feel in that tracking of breathing in and that tracking of breathing out, just keeping the breath in mind, keeping some relaxed interest with the natural process of breathing in and out, right? We're already suppressing those deep habits of the mind getting identified with the desire to think this, the desire to plan out that, the desire to move the body, the desire to be the best meditator in the group, you know, all these ways that our mind can get entangled. But it's not happening because we're having this exclusive thing that the mind is being trained to be interested in, breathing in and breathing out. And we start to feel what we call the pleasure of seclusion, which is the beginning of, it's not so much what's there, it's the agitation of being identified with desire, the limitation that comes with being identified with desires, that's being suppressed. So we're starting to feel the freedom. It's not so much the mind is getting something as it's stopping, abandoning something. And when that's sufficient, when that pleasure of seclusion is sufficient, then the pleasure itself becomes a very engaging object for the mind's attention. So it's actually like, as opposed to the ordinary experience of feeling the touching of the air as it goes in the nostrils and out the nostrils, the pleasure of seclusion, it's like, you know, that word rapture, the mind gets wrapped with that experience. It's very easy, relatively speaking, to be undistracted, not distracted, to have the continuity of present moment awareness when the pleasure of seclusion. And when that's strong enough, right, then a lot of joy arises, and that would be considered the first jhana, where the mind is so rapt, so engaged, attentive to the pleasure, the non-sensual pleasure, the pleasure that arises because the mind isn't doing what it normally does. That's its pleasure, not doing what it normally does. That there's a kind of stability in that absorption. And as those stages of jhana, deeper, refined, absorbed states, meditative states, then the fourth jhana, the deepest jhana, is defined, as I mentioned, because the pleasure, it's actually considered the fourth jhana beyond, like the mind is so withdrawn that it's even withdrawn from the dual nature of pleasure and pain. And so, like, the mind not being obsessed with pleasure and pain is experienced as the peace of the mind not agitated by the dualistic world of pleasure and pain. It's so removed from that ordinary level of existence that is really characterized by pain and pleasure. And that's what suppresses the craving, is it's so withdrawn. Because the jhana, that's a meditative state. We haven't uprooted the habit of being identified. We've just simply suppressed it. But the experience, the liberating experience, the taste of freedom, of non-craving, that's real. It's just that when that meditative absorption comes to its end, then the mind's other habits, like to get identified with desire, will reemerge. And the mind will once again get swept away and agitated by the ways it gets swept away, gets identified, right? And it will be confused by all of that again. But the nice thing about developing concentration, really understanding the pleasure of seclusion, is it creates the context for real faith. Like the peace that we feel, it kind of, in our mind, in our heart, it begs the question, can I have this peace all the time? Can I be even with what is uneven, not just when I have a deep meditative experience, but all day long? Because that's what our heart, mind really seeks. It's nice to have these sort of spiritual vacations into a very refined, stable experience of peace. But we don't want to have to return. We really, obviously, naturally desire, this is a wholesome desire, peace with conditions, not the peace that comes from withdrawing from the conditioned world, right? By turning the attention to the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of the mind, the mind not having to interact with this sort of grosser level of a pleasant experience, an unpleasant experience, a confusing experience, intense experience. But maybe that peace of non-grasping, the peace of non-attachment, can be here even with ordinary states of consciousness, not so withdrawn, right? That's what we desire. And so there's the equanimity that comes because the mind has really withdrawn. That's sort of the flavor of the fourth jhana, that peace of equanimity. The peace of the mind, like I mentioned a moment ago, that isn't seeking to get away from pain and seeking to get to pleasure. It's so withdrawn. So there's that peace. But there's also the equanimity, the peace that arises out of wisdom. So the wisdom that isn't confused by the ordinary expression of experience. It knows not to grasp. It knows that it is realized, oh, that's the way. Non-attachment, non-grasping, non-clinging is the way. And it isn't intellectual, it's experiential. I mean, we can think about it intellectually, right, like we're doing right now, but the point is to have that experience, right? Because then that clarifies the path. And in a way, our practice is all about clarifying the path. We shouldn't presume, that we actually know the path. And this is what the Buddha meant, in that what's considered traditionally at least one of the first Dharma talks, or maybe the first Dharma talk, where the Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths. So whether that's true or not, but it's just interesting that in the tradition, this teaching on the middle way, because that's what the middle way is all about. It's this understanding of not having to retreat from sense experience, rejecting that mode, like if only I didn't have sense experience. And that leads people to want to be ascetics, where, okay, I won't have to deal with a house. I'm not going to have a house. I'm not going to have a lot of stuff. I'm not going to have a partner. I'm not going to raise kids. I'm not going to have any responsibilities. I'll live in a simple cave, eat the fruit that falls from trees, or whatever. It just becomes its own way of being tight. That thinking that, if only I didn't have existence, if only I didn't have responsibilities. And the other is thinking that, no, having stuff, I just need to get the right stuff. And when I get the right stuff and I line things up just right, I'll just read how it goes in the sutta. This is the setting the wheel of the Dhamma in motion discourse or sutta. There are these two extremes that are not to be indulged in by one who has gone forth. Which two? That which is devoted to sensual pleasure with reference to sensual objects. This is base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable. And that which is devoted to self-affliction. Painful, unprofitable. Avoiding both of these extremes, the middle way realized by the Buddha, producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to calm, to direct knowledge, to awakening, to unbinding. And the path, the Buddha then goes on to talk about the Eightfold Path. And one way to think about the Eightfold Path, it's a path of this non-sensual pleasure. It's like learning how to attune to what this in a very real way, experience as pleasure, but it's the pleasure that comes from letting go, not the pleasure that comes from grasping. There's the pleasure of sila. Some of you know that Pali word, that deep valuing of non-harming, ethical conduct, right? So this is part of the path. But when we live with a lot of moral integrity in our lives, really caring about not harming others, not harming ourselves, it's really about letting go of the impulse to harm. And there's a pleasure in realizing, like, when I do have an impulse to take what hasn't been given to me, and I don't have to act on that impulse. I can feel the tug to take something that's not mine, but I don't have to act on it. And there's a pleasure in that. And then at night when we think back on the day and we feel the pleasure of not being haunted by all the mean things I did, all the ways that I misspoke, or all the ways that I manipulated other people or took advantage or stole things that weren't mine. Now that's a subtle pleasure, but it's a very real pleasure, even though it's subtle. And there's the pleasure of generosity, which is not about having something, but about sharing, what we have with others. There's a happiness of taking care of our mind, like having a mind that keeps loving kindness in mind instead of ill will in mind. Right? So abandoning ill will right, is the pleasure of metta, loving kindness. Abandoning distractedness is the pleasure of non-distractedness. So the whole path is a tuning, coming into allegiance with the pleasure, the non-sensual pleasures. And we absolutely have to tune in because there's really no way to abandon craving. And that's the very definition of awakening. Nibbana is the abandoning of craving, right? And there's no abandoning craving without tuning into the pleasure, the non-sensual pleasures of letting go. All the ways we let go. So it's not just the deepest way of letting go of that sense of a fixed self, a fixed me, I, me, mine. Yeah, that's the subtle and very powerful thing that the mind will eventually abandon, that clinging to the sense of self, a permanent self. But there are much more available, obvious ways to start tuning in to non-sensual pleasures around sila, morality, non-harming, around generosity, around kindness, around just like we cultivate a garden, cultivating qualities of mind that are more about what's not there in our mind than what is there in the mind. So instead of like, we're sort of pulling weeds from the mind, using that garden metaphor. It's like, no, the mind can be, we can start to learn to live with a mind that is empty of so much of what is unnecessary. And when we look, like if we somehow had a way to see what's moving in our mind all day long, it would be so easy to start abandoning because so much of what the mind is taking a hold of, thinking about, is clearly not to our benefit or anybody's benefit. It's just the action of habit, to worry, to plan, to think, to regurgitate the past, to fantasize. All these things the mind just does, you know, it's really different addictive patterns. The mind looking for a little juice, a little energy by, you know, digging into this provocative topic, provocative for our mind, whatever. It's not the same for each of us, of course, where we go. Before the Buddha's awakening, one of the kings of one of the nations in the northern India at the time, King Bimbisara, saw the Bodhisattva, the Buddha before his awakening out in the distance and thought, oh, he seems like a pretty impressive person. Maybe I can recruit him to be part of my, one of my ministers or one of my generals or something like that. And so he goes to the Buddha to be and makes an offer, basically, abandon the spiritual life you're leading and come join be one of my ministers or one of my generals. I've got a place for you. And this is the Buddha's response. Household life is crowded, a realm of dust, while going forth is the open air. Seeing the danger and sensual pleasures and renunciation, the non-clinging, as rest, I go to strive. That's where my heart delights. That's where my mind finds bliss. Right? And this is like, we can even, if we're going to imagine, this is something to play with in our own mind, imagining our life, with our particular set of circumstances. But imagine starting to notice and then more and more to delight in the pleasures of non-attachment, letting go, and to see this slowly, gradually begin to dominate our life. So use our imagination in this way, not so much imagining accumulation, accumulating status, accumulating resources, money, clothes, nice memories. Like we even want to accumulate nice memories, right? And it's not that we have to be afraid of nice stuff happening or having nice stuff, but what our heart is more and more taking refuge in, more and more delighting in, is the non-attachment, the non-dependence, right? But we have to, it's like that shift in allegiance really requires the work of getting interested in the reality of this pleasure of non-grasping, of equanimity with sense experience, even among what is uneven. Well, there's so much more to say, but maybe I'll leave it here. We have about 15 minutes left. Really would appreciate people sharing your own experiences where you've tasted, just in ordinary ways, that movement from seeing accumulation or having or getting rid of as the way to happiness, to just beginning to sense in little places in your life the real spiritual joy of non-attachment, the real spiritual joy of non-dependence, or any of these ways that I've been speaking about. And of course, any questions you have about this topic, um, totally appropriate. Anybody can unmute themselves. It's always nice to say your first name. You can share where you're coming from, and also, if you want, share your pronouns. Yeah, Edith, do you want to go first?
I will. My name is Edith, she, her pronouns. um, Mark, I think you'll remember I've told you on two occasions about a very profound experience I had with our friend Andy in regards to equanimity, where I experienced a really intimate moment of equanimity in a very real sense and the power of it. And I wanted to say that I went to Andy at a time when I was experiencing something really profoundly difficult. And I'm in that same place, experiencing something really profoundly difficult. And tonight, when you said, life's like this now, which I've heard you say a whole lot of times, but what you added to it, for me, made it go from intellectual to personal, and it just stopped me and helped me to really let go. My nephew always says that myself and his mom always go to DEF CON when there's any, little thing. I mean, this is not a little thing. But what you said that was so powerful to me was when you said, life's like this now, isn't it? And it was the isn't it that it just I mean, the life like this now is the intellectual piece, but for me the isn't it was the very profound and intimate piece. And I immediately felt that experience that I had with Andy, and so I feel very grateful and very lucky to both you and Andy to give me that opportunity to really experience the power of equanimity. And so I thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Edith. Freedom, it's nice to have these people willing to share because freedom is real. And these tastes of freedom that isn't because the moment is special, it's because the mind let go of what was extra. And then what the mind is left with is a deepening sense that it's always available. The mind just has to remember to be interested, to not be swept away. And even when we hear someone else like Edith report, right, that it can remind us, it can loosen some screws so we're more interested. Who would like to go next?
Mark, I'd just like to say one other thing. I think for me, this really indicates the importance of a teacher how you said we just have to remember, to do this. Well, duh, but it's not so easy to remember in the, when stuff is really whirling around. And so I think that's why it's so important to have a teacher, and I'm just grateful.
Yeah, one way or another, we have to keep the teachings in front of us because we live, most of us, in ways where other stuff will naturally be in front of us. We'll be swept away by, cultural influences. And so whether we're using teachers or using our own dedication of study or spiritual friends, but one way or another, we have to stay exposed to the teachings to be inspired, because otherwise we won't practice. Practice is when we take teachings and we use them to as almost as an intervention for how we're relating to the present moment, right? To intercept or to interrupt the habit of how we relate to the present moment. We take the teachings from our friends and our teachers and our own study, and and it's helping us relate differently than the way we've been conditioned to relate to experience. Yeah, who'd like to share next or questions that come up? Hi, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Sheher. I'm in Minneapolis. Um, Today I had this experience. I've been taking a friend, she's ill, to the Mayo Clinic for several appointments over the past months, and invariably the same thing occurs. I tell her what time I'll pick her up. She's invariably late, and then we're late for her appointment. And today I was sitting in the car waiting for her, and I really sort of became aware of that and my reaction to this, and I realized, oh, she's not doing what I want her to do, you know, and I'm getting all upset about this because now she's going to be late for her appointment. I mean, this has happened repeatedly every time we go. And today, for the first time, I think I was just able to let go of that and just it is what it is. She's late. This is happening. We'll get there when we get there. And I realized how freeing that was, not to be, my body would get tight about it and I'd be upset about it. And it was like, oh, it doesn't have to be this way. I don't have to cling to that. It doesn't matter. It's just the way it is. So it was helpful.
Yeah. And I kind of, these experiences like Susan just reported, I don't know if people remember, but I think it was Malcolm Gladwell wrote that book about like what makes somebody a real master at something. And I think the conclusion was we have to do something 10,000 times. Because when we have 10,000 of those experiences that Susan just described, what happens is at some point there's a tipping point and the mind generalizes the insight, the understanding, right? And it changes the conditioning of the mind. So instead of getting irritated when things are frustrating and aren't going the way we think they should go, the mind has this new habit, which is like, yeah, either honk your horn or don't. That's not the issue. Just don't get tight. So if you decide to honk your horn to speed up your friend, you know, do with all the love in your heart, but no frustration, no tightness. Or if you decide not to honk your horn or not to, intervene, fine. But why get tight? Why have the heart bound up as if there's a problem here? Who's that helping? Yeah, thanks, Susan. Who'd like to go next? Examples from your life where you've tasted this non-central freedom that comes with letting things go, letting things be. Including doubts that you might have. Hi, Hi, Mimi.
Hi. I was I have a couple examples that tie in, but I'm recalling a time when I was leading a group of a mindfulness group of teenagers, and we went, I'd been teaching them for a while, but we went on a field trip to this ropes course. And I just remember Jamil standing, he's 18 years old and he's standing on top of this really tall platform and he's about to zip line. And he just like shouts down at me and he says, "Oh, this mindful breathing thing is no joke." And that's really what I mean, we were all laughing because we were like, all you can, do is breathe. Like, there's nothing else to do. And I just caught myself feeling that way today with the current events in the world. Just like, wow, when your back is up against the wall. And it's like, what is there left to do but to breathe and to let go? And also on the contemplation of death and the meditation we did together in Buddhist studies on Monday night, just like, wow, what really is there to do at the time of dying than to learn to than to let go and to breathe through it. Um and there is like a pleasure in the release of all of that. And in a way, it's the only way that, you know, we could jump off that platform and zip line was the release, the letting go, the ease of how scary those conditions are. It just popped up in my mind. But and also just to really appreciate your metaphor of being even with what's uneven. It's just immediately my body felt regulated just hearing that. Just had, just really wonderful sit with that simple metaphor. And it kind of makes me think of dancing a little bit, just, there isn't a resistance. There's a beauty and a grace and a flexibility and a playfulness and a kindness. Um, but and a relation, like being in relation, not the asceticism like you mentioned of, but being in relation to the causes and conditions, but with that beautiful equanimity. So, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Mimi. Beautiful. Still have a couple minutes left. Time to hear from at least one or maybe two more folks. What else comes to mind? Examples from your life? Any fears around the downsides of non-clinging?
I'll say something in that regard. And I've heard you answer this question or versions of it, and yet it always seems that there's more for me to learn. It seems as though there's a very fine and maybe no distinction sometimes between not clinging and not caring. Yeah, sort of deciding something isn't important seems like it could be the wrong thing to do. And so that feels like the risk for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your comments. Oh, and I should have said, yeah, my name is Steve. I'm here from suburb of Minneapolis, Golden Valley, he, him pronoun.
Yeah, and I think that um, mystery between the experience of non-attachment and the quivering, tender quivering of just appreciating our own suffering, the suffering of others, and just the caring about the enormity of suffering in life. But there is something about the development of practice that given the truth of suffering, that there is the experience of not being burdened by the truth of suffering. Like, and it's hard to talk about like how we can be touched by it. The heart's sensitive, but the mind isn't doing anything, isn't grasping that pain. It's similar to like grieving. When we've really had a big loss, initially there's a way that the mind resists the pain of that loss in all kinds of ways, But there are moments, and then usually over more and more time, more and more of those moments where the pain of the loss, the realization of the loss and the pain of that loss, there's very little struggle or defense around the pain of the loss. And the grief just sort of moves. And weirdly, it actually feels kind of good. I don't know, you don't hear people say this too much, but when grief is moving without resistance, it kind of feels good to be caring so much about the person we're caring about, that we're experiencing the loss around. So that I think is true also in terms of just the being proximate to a lot of suffering, that it actually strangely feels good to be unafraid to be moved by the suffering. So the equanimity, the wisdom really allows our heart to be touched, and for the quivering of that being touched, like to really feel it. But there's no defense around what we're feeling. And it's best to start in just sort of simple places, not the places maybe where there's the greatest exposure to suffering or the greatest pain in our lives, but just sort of ordinary things that touch us. We read a letter from a friend or an email or go to somebody's Caring Bridge site that we know, but they're not like our best friend or something. And just to sort of recognize the truth, this person's life is in chaos. And to really let it land and not be afraid, not be embarrassed by the fact that that's not happening to me. My life is comfortable, and just let the whole catastrophe move through without grasping. Of course, there's a lot. This would be a great discussion for all of us to have. Maybe we'll find a way back to this, that Steve's comments opened up, because I think it's really important. It'd be nice to hear people's experience, and maybe just find someone close in the next week to just talk about this place that Steve mentioned, how can we care and have equanimity? What does that feel and look like? Yeah, thanks everyone. So nice to be together. I'll just mention one thing coming up. Shelley Graff is going to be out at the retreat center for 2 weeks in April, the first half of April, basically, for people just to come out. We call it a teacher-led practice period. And I think people can come out for any number of days, depending on your schedule. So it's on the calendar. You can just register and maybe go for a weekend or a couple days or a longer period if that makes sense. Yeah, that's a wonderful way to get to know our retreat center, to be there with Shelley. Thanks for showing up, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself to say goodnight if you'd like.
Thanks, Mark. Good night, everyone.